Vladimir Putin tosses and turns in the night. After all, he's a man with a lot on his mind, and the war in Ukraine is not going well. What he promised as a short war ending in total conquest, with Russia reincorporating Ukraine into its territory, has turned into a brutal slog entering its second year. Russian troops are leaving with faulty armor and coming back in body bags. Russia's under heavy sanctions and increasingly isolated from the world community. And he's just been indicted for war crimes. But as Putin returns to sleep, his thoughts turn to brighter things. After all, there's a plan, and before he passes from this realm, Putin fully intends to see a world where the sun never sets on the Russian Empire. But is this remotely feasible? Does Russia really have a plan to take over the world? The answer is yes, but it's more like 10 different plans, some a lot more likely than others. In some ways, this plan was in effect for a long time, but some stumbling blocks have caused it to fall apart. While Ukraine was an independent country since the fall of the Soviet Union, its independence was tentative at best, and most of its leaders were seen as corrupt Kremlin puppets. Putin was able to slowly chop off pieces of the country and take them back into Russia with minimum resistance, until the last Kremlin puppet was toppled in a popular revolt, and free elections saw the rise of Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian turned unabashedly pro-Western, pro-NATO candidate who now stands as the face of resistance to Putin's war. And Putin is determined to not let this happen again. The first step of Putin's plan to take over the world is to regain all his former territory. After all, the Soviet Union's collapse cost Russia a lot, almost a quarter of its land area as well as around a third of the population. And according to Putin, all those territories are still in Russia's sphere, and he reserves the right to reclaim them. He's starting with Ukraine, but he has no intention of stopping there. And the first country to be targeted might already be onto him. Moldova is a small country in Eastern Europe, and it doesn't actually border Russia. Instead, it's sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania. It's landlocked, but it's still important geographically due to its access points on the western side of Ukraine. That means that Russia's been interested in it for a long time, and it actually has a beachhead there already. The small, unrecognized country of Transnistria is a breakaway region of Moldova between Ukraine and the Dniester River in Moldova. It has a strongly pro-Russian population, and even a contingent of Russian soldiers. Many people have speculated that Putin might try to open a new front in Ukraine by invading from there, but the Moldovan government might have something to say about that, which is why Putin might have already begun the process of destabilizing them. In early 2023, Moldova was hit by massive government crisis that saw the pro-Western prime minister and most of the government resign. President Maya Sandu impressed the world when she issued a condemnation of Russian meddling, reaffirmed her commitment to cooperation with the West, and appointed a new pro-Western prime minister. But what surprised everyone was what came next. She increased cooperation with Zelensky, and the two revealed a blockbuster report that indicated that Russia was actively trying to unbalance and destroy the small nation, no doubt to reincorporate it back into its territory as a puppet state. The only question was, how far had it gone? According to secret documents obtained by pro-Western groups, Russia's meddling in Moldova goes deep, and they've been working to prevent the country from aligning itself with the West for a long time. Russia is paranoid that Moldova is about to join NATO, turning away from the country's previous neutrality, and they have a 10-year plan to prevent it and bring it firmly within Russia's sphere of influence. The first step is to continue to consolidate power in Transnistria. While Russia is still firmly in control there, there's an increasing pro-Moldovan sentiment, as some residents wonder if being under a de facto military occupation in a state that doesn't exist is the best thing they can do. But that's only the beginning. Russia's looking to weaponize just about every pro-Russian corner of Moldovan culture, using many of the same tools they were using in Ukraine. The short-term goals include building support for closer relations with Russia, neutralizing any attempts to reincorporate Transnistria, and pushing for pro-Russian candidates in elections. To push toward this goal, Russia is using some of its favorite tricks. The Russian Orthodox Church, a powerful political force that's usually fiercely loyal to Putin, has faced reprisals in Ukraine as the war drags on. But arresting priests never looks so good to the media, and the Moldovan government might be hesitant to push back too hard. And of course, there's nothing that speaks louder than money. Russian oligarchs have big sway in that country, but only as much sway as Putin allows them, which is why many powerful Russians are taking their business to countries where Putin wants to build influence. One case like this is Ilan Shor, a powerful figure in the Moldovan opposition who has been key in stirring up anti-Western protests in Moldova. He's seen as a Russian asset, so closely aligned that he's been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department. That hasn't diminished his influence, and there's a good chance that he would be Putin's choice to lead a future puppet government. But this is only the beginning. As time goes on, Russia's plan is not just to isolate Moldova, but to create a status quo where it has no choice but to depend fully on Russia. That's why isolating Moldova from NATO is a key goal for Russia. By distributing propaganda portraying NATO as a danger to Moldova's security, a new generation might rise and vote in pro-Russian politicians. And the next step is to do the same to Moldova's closest ally, Romania. The bordering nation has close ties to Moldova, with many residents even considering reunification if it'll provide better protection from Russia. This is why Russia's begun a propaganda campaign portraying Romania as the one looking to expand into Moldova and undermine its independence. Will it work? Well, Putin did campaign on denazifying Ukraine, the country with a Jewish leader. Once rivals to Russia's power have been neutralized in Moldova, the next step is to create stable, long-term power structures that will answer to Russia and be hostile toward the West. This would essentially turn Moldova into a full-on puppet state that could be used to advance Russia's long-term goals. Would Russia eventually annex Moldova? It's not clear if that's feasible with Ukraine in the way, but if Russia's pipe dream of conquering Ukraine comes to pass, it would become a lot more likely. So Russia's first step in taking over the world would ideally begin without a shot being fired against Russian troops, and the same might go for Russia's second conquest. If you ask people where they were going to vacation in Europe, Belarus would probably be the last place on people's lists. Of all the former Soviet socialist republics on the continent, it's fared the worst since independence, and it's largely all due to one man, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. He rules the country with an iron fist, crushing dissent and protests while holding on to power largely through staged elections. He has few allies besides Putin, and Russia was heavily involved in helping him hold on to power after the last election. And Putin is only too willing to dig his claws in deeper. Lukashenko's grip on power is more tentative than it's been since 1994. He's no longer acknowledged as the legitimate president of Belarus by most Western nations and is increasingly seen as an outlaw since his shocking interception of an Irish passenger plane into Belarusian territory. This led to the arrest of an opposition figure from Belarus, an action condemned worldwide. As the man known as the last dictator of Europe, at least until Putin tightened the screws, continues to isolate himself, Putin might be seeking to take full control, because Belarus is incredibly useful to Putin's plans. Belarus is located directly on top of Ukraine, and its border provides better access to Kyiv than anywhere in Russia. In the opening days of the war, Putin's troops invaded through Belarus as they were given free passage, but Ukraine held on and routed them even before the NATO weapons arrived. Since then, Belarus has been more cagey about the war, taking Putin's side but not being willing to commit troops to aid the next attack. This is largely because Lukashenko's grip on power might not survive an uprising against a mobilization, and he's likely also worried about increased sanctions targeting his country, which means Putin might want to take a more direct path to gaining control. According to a news report in February 2023, Putin's executive office has a 7-year plan to take full control of Belarus and has discussed it with his military officials. Belarus has never had a true change of power, which means Lukashenko is essentially the state. But the Soviet-style dictator is getting up there in years. At 68, he's close to Putin's age, and he won't be able to hold on to power forever. Putin has no guarantee that Lukashenko's successor will remain friendly to him, so it might work out better if there is no successor, which means Putin is going for full annexation. The internal strategy document referred to a union state of Russia and Belarus and presents a plan that would result in the full first reclamation of a country that gained independence after the fall of the Soviet Union. While Russia's tactics toward Ukraine and Moldova have been hostile, Belarus is a close ally, and it's believed Putin wants to achieve this goal through economic and political means, while using his close connection to Lukashenko to boost the Russian military presence in Belarus. Both Putin and Lukashenko have been tight-lipped about this, but Lukashenko might prefer Belarus becoming a full Russian puppet state to turning over power to his opponents. And this might be just the beginning. Is Russia planning to come for the rest of Europe? If you listen to one advisor, the answer is definitely yes. Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov, who's been one of Putin's most brutal enforcers during the Ukraine war, has repeatedly boasted of attacking Poland next and using weapons of mass destruction against anyone who resists. Of course, Poland is probably asking, you in what army, as the Russian military is heavily depleted. But the threat of a Russian attack is weighing heavily on its neighbors. Romania and Poland are already NATO members. Finland just joined, and Sweden is likely to be next in line. This limits Putin's options for conquest, because in NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded after World War II and includes most of Western and Central Europe, along with Canada and the United States. That means if Putin invades Romania or Finland, he will have more than 30 countries breathing down his neck, including 3 nuclear powers. He's responded to every NATO investment in Ukraine with threats of invasion and even of nuclear attacks, but no one knows how seriously he can be taken or even how many of Russia's Cold War-era nukes are still functional. If the war in Ukraine has shown one thing, it's that Russia won't be able to conquer the world simply by running it over with Soviet-era tanks, which means that he might have to take a different approach. If Putin was to actually invade a NATO nation, there are likely only 3 outcomes. The first, and the one Putin is no doubt hoping for, is that the attack breaks the spirit of NATO. The alliance members refuse to respond and risk a larger war. The NATO treaty guarantees are shown to be only worth the paper they're printed on, and Putin marches from one country to another reclaiming the Soviet Union's old territory. But this seems extremely unlikely, especially after Ukraine. The second option sees NATO forces rout the same overextended Russian forces we're seeing now, and the third sees Putin resort to nuclear weapons and likely trigger World War III. In those 2 scenarios, it's highly unlikely that Putin comes out victorious and likely loses everything, which means Putin might be thinking south instead. Most of the territory Russia lost when the Soviet Union collapsed was in Europe, but another swath of land went its own way as well. These are the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Kazakhstan was the single largest country to gain independence after the collapse. It's currently the 9th largest country in the world. All of these countries are Muslim nations, and most are mainly made up of deserts but are rich in energy resources. Several are still ruled by dictators, and the governments in them are hardly stable. As a famous internet meme would say, it's free real estate. None of these countries are involved in NATO or likely to be defended by the US or other world powers, and none have especially strong militaries or nuclear weapons, which means that they might be the path of least resistance if Putin wanted to grow his territory quickly. There are still some stumbling blocks in the way of a conquest of Central Asia, the biggest being that Putin's military is at its weakest in years due to how many soldiers and how much equipment has been lost in Ukraine. This means that a well-organized but small military force could still inflict costly losses, and in the worst-case scenario, turn Kazakhstan and its neighboring states into a repeat of the Soviet quagmire in Afghanistan. The massive oil reserves in Kazakhstan might also bring the US and other countries indirectly into the conflict, looking to force a closer relationship with the country and inflict another black eye on Putin. Which means Putin's best approach going forward might not be the iron fist, but the velvet glove. Putin's increasingly isolated on the world stage, but that might not tell the whole story. While almost all of Europe and the United States have sanctioned the country, only a small percentage of the world's countries have joined in. While these are among the biggest economies in the world, other major powers have been friendlier. For some of these countries, it's simply a matter of realpolitik. In the case of Israel, Putin plays a major role in restraining dangerous forces in Syria, which is right on Israel's border. Since the start, Israel's tried to play both sides, offering humanitarian aid to Ukraine and taking in refugees while refusing to send military aid for fear of angering Putin. And with the return of far-right Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel might tilt even closer to Russia's side, especially if tensions ramp up with the US over proposed judicial reforms and settlement expansion. And the same might go for one of the world's fastest-growing economies. On the surface, India might seem to be a natural ally for the Western Bloc, as they're arch rivals with Pakistan, which is considered close to the Russian sphere. The country is about to become the most populous in the world, and its manufacturing sector is seen by many as an alternative to China's. But while the country has many shared interests with the West, its current leader Narendra Modi is potentially tilting toward Putin. The far-right leader with ties to controversial Hindu groups has attracted condemnation for some of his crackdowns, and Modi has kept the door open to greater cooperation with Russia's leader. So Putin might be finding a listening ear in fellow far-right leaders. But that might not be where he finds his biggest supporters. It seems to most people in the West that Russia v. Ukraine is one of the most straightforward military conflicts in recent memory, with a brutal imperialistic country invading a smaller nation. But not everyone sees it that way, with many left-leaning activists and leaders framing the conflict as a proxy battle of Russia v. NATO. Their main argument being that NATO provoked the conflict by adding new countries to its sphere of influence that would normally be considered within Russia's sphere of influence. Most rallies calling for NATO to pull out have been small, but that hasn't stopped some of the world leaders from siding with Russia on those grounds. Most are a controversial gang of rogues, but not all of them. Russia's had few choices for supporters in recent months, but it's found 2 regular weapon suppliers in Iran and North Korea. Both are avowed enemies of the United States and NATO and have relished in supplying Russia with drones and other weapons. However, both of these countries are considered outlaw nations as well, heavily sanctioned by the West, so their motivation might be just as much down to self-interest. Now they have a ready and willing buyer for their high-end weapons and a potential nuclear-armed ally against the United States. But not all countries taking Russia's side fit this profile. In recent months, several prominent leaders have made statements calling for de-escalation in the conflict and for NATO to withdraw support, or blaming the US and NATO for instigating the war. When Putin was indicted by the International Criminal Court, South Africa was quick to say that he would be allowed to come to the country without fearing arrest. The current leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, has continued the country's post-apartheid tilt to the left, but due to South Africa's limited military presence and distance from the conflict, this isn't seen as a game-changer. The same can't be said for another country across the Atlantic. When former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva completed a shocking comeback, going from prison to returning to the presidency and unseating far-right President Bolsonaro, most people thought that he would tilt the country back toward the center. After all, Bolsonaro had been overly cozy toward Putin, and Lula's election was greeted with jubilation by most Western leaders. He was even immediately invited to the White House by President Biden, who hoped for a new era of U.S.-Brazilian cooperation. But things turned out very differently. Not long after taking office, interviews from the campaign surfaced in which Lula claimed that Ukraine and the West had helped to provoke the war by NATO expanding east. Even more shockingly, Lula soon invited Iranian warships to dock in Rio, spurring fear that he was joining a global anti-US alliance that would likely back Putin. So far, Lula's not made any more public statements, but it's likely that Putin sees an opening to push back against the US and forge a powerful alliance south of the United States. But none of these allies can really change the playing field, only one other can. Putin insists on governing Russia like it's still a superpower that can influence the world stage by force. Although it's far from that these days, it is a great power at most, and most believe it's seriously in decline. The same can't be said for the other great power of the communist side of the Cold War, China. Under Xi Jinping, China's aggressively expanded into the South China Sea, violated the territorial waters of Vietnam and the Philippines, and continued to menace Taiwan with threats of invasion. And that might mean he has a vested interest in seeing Putin succeed. Many people believe the age of conquest is over and the age of international law has begun, until Russia invaded Ukraine. A success for the invaders, along with grudging global acceptance as the result, would have emboldened other countries to take the same action, particularly China with Taiwan. On the other hand, a Ukrainian victory made possible by NATO support would increase the odds that the US would follow through on its promises to defend Taiwan if attacked, and expand its sphere of influence in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, all of which are staunch US allies and increasingly replacing China as the top places for manufacturing in Asia. Which is why Xi Jinping continues to consider stepping into the fray in Ukraine. While Xi offered initial support for Putin in the opening days of the invasion and has continued to provide supplies, China has not provided lethal aid to Russia. So far, at least. Xi continues to dangle it like a stick in front of the West, threatening to step in if the US says the wrong thing about Taiwan or the South China Sea. Putin's job is simple: convince Xi to step off the fence and become the equivalent backer to NATO. Of course, to do that, he has to convince Xi that he still has a chance of winning, which might be why he's fighting so hard right now. Putin seems to only have one goal: to bring Russia back to the status it enjoyed during the Cold War. It might take an enormous amount of sacrifice on Russia's part, but he's willing to live with that. However, no matter how determined he is, Putin has no chance at taking over the world if he doesn't get his allies to come off the fence. But if he does, it could be an incredibly risky long-term gambit to undo much of the progress made since the end of the Cold War. What would a Russian takeover of the world actually look like? One thing is for sure: it's not likely to look like a massive sneak attack on the world to kick off a hot war. While Russia does have the most nuclear weapons in the world, it's possible that only a fraction of them will work anymore, and he'd be completely outmatched by the US, Britain, and France. To say nothing of the fact that usually no one wins a nuclear war. Instead, odds are that Putin's hoping to slowly boil the frog, taking one piece at a time and daring anyone to oppose him. If China comes off the fence and he's able to make further inroads into Ukraine with Chinese arms, he's hoping that Western support will dry up, and he might want to fall back on his old tactic of election interference. The biggest win Putin could get is possibly in the 2024 US election, where there's a good chance that Biden will be facing off against his old nemesis Donald Trump. While Biden's been staunchly pro-Ukraine, Trump's always been close to Putin and has even talked about pulling out of NATO entirely. While Trump's Republican rival Ron DeSantis hasn't gone that far, he's also made statements indicating he views Ukraine as a simple territorial dispute that the US shouldn't be too involved in. So maybe the best investment Putin could make is in another elaborate Facebook propaganda campaign around the next election. And it's not the only Ukraine ally he's hoping to destabilize. In France, a key part of NATO, current President Emmanuel Macron is staunchly pro-NATO. But both the far-right and far-left parties trying to unseat him advocate for pulling away from the alliance. Putin suffered a defeat in the UK when anti-NATO Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was ousted from leadership of the party by moderate Keir Starmer. But a strong anti-NATO, anti-American movement persists in the country, so Putin's playing the long game, hoping that when he starts making bigger moves, he'll get a favorable political environment that would allow him to continue to expand. And then a lot of things could happen very quickly. In Putin's mind, the Western order would fall apart piece by piece. First, a pro-Russian government would come into power in Moldova, essentially signing the country over to him. The same would happen in Belarus, with Lukashenko giving Putin a carte blanche to take over, rather than allow fair and free elections. From there, he'd start destabilizing the governments in Central Asia using the same playbook. Rather than invading, when possible, he would simply boost corrupt allies and take over the country piece by piece. As one country after another joins his sphere of influence, he would begin intimidating the countries on their borders, presenting them with the choice of joining Russia by contract or by force. From there, he would heavily rely on new allies. China will play the biggest role, supplying Russia with weapons. This might also be the time that China would make bigger moves in the South China Sea to invade Taiwan, hoping the new anti-intervention governments will stay hands-off. No doubt, both China and Russia will make liberal use of threats to use weapons of mass destruction and hope the bluff works. If Putin's able to forge close alliances with countries like Brazil and South Africa, he might try for a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, stationing weapons in those countries, offering them a clear shot at the US and other Western-aligned nations near them. And then, when the time comes for a big move, all the cards will be in his favor. To finally break the NATO line, Putin would likely fabricate a cause and a claim he's retaliating, possibly a false flag terror attack in one of the countries he's conquered. From there, a large-scale invasion and many threats might convince some NATO ambivalent members to pull the plug on the alliance entirely and leave everyone to fend for themselves. Putin would have achieved his goal of reviving the Soviet-era power of Russia and broken his opposition, and would likely then continue building up to eventually challenge China, expand his reach into Asia, and then the world. But is any of this actually realistic? In a word, no. It requires every possible thing to go Putin's way, including relying on everyone being intimidated by him, something that's looking more and more unlikely with every passing day, as his army gets routed by Ukraine's new technology and he fails to even take eastern cities like Bakhmut. As he drags Russia's armies deeper and deeper into the quagmire, rumors increase that his own countrymen and generals might be getting ready to depose him. China's likely looking for evidence of strength before it commits and escalates its bad blood with the West, and those signs are few and far between. In other words, Putin had better not count on any more lovely dreams of world conquest and should prepare for quite a few sleepless nights. Want to know more about the current state of the war? Watch how Ukraine retaking Crimea would tear Russia apart. And for a look at how Russia's invasion has made NATO stronger, check out US reaction if Russia attacks Finland.